Under the sweeping skies of eastern Oregon, nestled in a sparsely populated valley flanked by ridgelines and forgotten roads, stood Owen Lynch's property, a stretch of land he'd inherited from his uncle, who had inherited it from a grandfather neither of them liked but both respected. The land was dry, stubborn, and unforgiving, the kind that yielded only to those willing to bleed for it. Owen didn't mind that. He wasn't looking for comfort. What he valued was space. Space to breathe. Space to move. Space to be left alone. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and he liked it that way. His house wasn't fancy. A weathered, single-story structure with creaking steps and a porch that leaned ever so slightly to the west. But behind it, the centerpiece of the property stood proud, an old, timber-framed barn, reinforced over the years with steel, concrete footings, and a roof replaced after the last big winter storm nearly took it off. It wasn't a relic, it was a working space. It smelled of oil, old rope, and pine. Inside, Owen had tools, storage for seasonal equipment, and, most notably, a shooting setup, a back wall lined with stacked hay bales and homemade steel targets, the kind that rang like a bell when struck just right. The barn wasn't just for fun, it was functional, legal, and it gave Owen and his small group of close friends, mostly ranchers and occasional hunters from around the county, a quiet place to practice and train without bothering anyone. They followed safety protocols to the letter. There were no parties, no late-night noise, no reckless behavior, just practice, community, and tradition. That barn had stood for nearly 80 years, and in Owen's mind it was going to stand for 80 more, so long as he drew breath. Life out there wasn't glamorous, but it was clean. Owen had worked hard to keep the property self-sustaining. A solar array ran most of the house. He kept a diesel generator locked in a concrete slab outbuilding for emergencies. He'd installed motion lights, trail cameras, and a gate at the only road leading in. He wasn't paranoid, just practical. He'd seen enough changes in nearby towns over the last 5 years to know how quickly a place could be swallowed whole by newcomers with capital and plans. It always started with a smile and a clipboard. Then came the zoning adjustments, the meetings you didn't get invited to, and before long fences went up in places they didn't belong. It wasn't until mid-June, a Monday morning after a weekend trip into town for supplies, that Owen noticed something wrong. It wasn't anything dramatic. No broken glass or smoking ruins. Just a metal stake, freshly hammered into the ground, positioned about 10 feet from the southeast corner of his barn. He frowned at it. Bright orange paint marked its tip, and a thin, plastic ribbon fluttered from its side in the warm breeze. He'd seen those before, at construction sites and development tracks. Surveyor's stake. But he hadn't requested a survey. He knelt down, brushed aside some of the dry grass, and found a second stake, this one partially buried and topped with a laminated tag. He squinted at the faded text. Boundary Adjustment Initiative, Phase 2. No name, no seal, no contact number. Just that phrase, printed in a cheap sans serif font. Something cold passed through Owen's chest, but he didn't panic. Not yet. He stood up slowly and walked the perimeter of the barn. Another stake, then another, all marked in the same way. He followed them out toward the eastern field, and sure enough, a set of deep tire tracks had crushed the tall grass along his private service road, the same road that had remained untouched for over 3 years. Someone had come in while he was gone, left no notice, and marked his land. He went back to the house and pulled up the outdoor camera footage. The gate hadn't triggered, nothing unusual there, but the east field wasn't under camera. He'd always figured there was no need. No one ever came that way. That assumption, it seemed, had expired. 2 days later, he received a letter in the mail, postmarked from within the county. The envelope was pristine, heavy stock, and bore a gold-embossed seal that looked suspiciously like a logo. The return address was listed simply as Development Oversight Committee. Inside was a 3-paragraph notice written in slick legalese. explaining that due to adjustments to land use classifications and ongoing infrastructure improvements, several properties, including his, were being evaluated for repurposing. The letter made no specific demands, issued no deadlines, but included the vague suggestion that non-residential structures may be subject to relocation or integration into the future development plan. Owen didn't slam the table. He didn't shout. He simply folded the letter, placed it next to the others that had arrived over the past year, flyers about new subdivision opportunities, marketing circulars promising a refreshed rural vision, and invitations to community input meetings he never attended, and poured himself a cup of black coffee. This wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something coordinated. His barn was in their way, and they wanted him to move. The next visit came not by mail, but by vehicle. A white SUV rolled up the drive one morning just after sunrise. The woman who stepped out wore tailored slacks, a pastel blouse, and sunglasses too large for her narrow face. She smiled like someone who'd practiced smiling in a mirror. She introduced herself as Judith Manson, a liaison officer from the committee, and requested to take a brief informational walk around the eastern boundary of the property. Owen met her on the porch and didn't invite her past the gate. She explained in a voice that hovered between condescension and false concern that the barn had been improperly categorized on regional maps and might not meet the new utility compliance guidelines being pushed by the county. When he asked her what that meant, she dodged. When he asked if the barn was under any kind of legal review, she said not officially. When he asked what precisely she wanted, she smiled wider and said just cooperation. Owen told her the barn wasn't moving. She nodded as if she had expected it and left without shaking his hand. He didn't hear anything for another week. No calls, no letters. Then, early one evening, he drove back from the feed store and noticed the lock on the barn had been tampered with. Not broken, but scratched, like someone had tried, failed, and left in a hurry. Inside, nothing was missing. But near the hay bales at the back he found something odd. A laminated sign with the words, "Under review, structural integrity analysis pending." It hadn't been there before. No one had permission to enter. Someone had crossed a line. It no longer felt like a slow push. It felt like a hand on his shoulder, firm and unrelenting. Owen removed the sign and resecured the barn. That night he didn't sleep well. He checked the cameras 3 times. No movement. He stared at the screen long enough to see bugs flicker across the lens and shadows shift with the wind. In the morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the next signpost, the next trespass, the next quietly worded letter designed to undermine everything he'd built. If they wanted to challenge the legitimacy of his barn, fine. He'd make it official. He'd make it visible. He would turn that space into a certified, legally protected facility, a shooting gallery registered for safety instruction and marksmanship training, open by appointment, monitored, insured, and above all, compliant. And he'd do it loud enough for the whole damn committee to hear. Because Owen Lynch hadn't spent 20 years on this land building something he loved just to have it erased with a smile, a letter, and a stake in the dirt. The first thing Owen noticed was the silence. Not the usual peaceful stillness of rural mornings, but a deliberate absence, something manufactured. No mail truck, no electric hum from the pump, no morning delivery of propane, which he had scheduled 3 days ago. The road leading up to his property was unusually clear, as if traffic had simply chosen to forget he existed. It wasn't until he went to check the external breaker box that he saw the thick red tag wrapped around the handle. Temporarily disconnected. Municipal Compliance Review. There was no technician, no notice, no prior communication. Just a heavy lock he didn't recognize and a tag that gave no direct contact number. Owen tried the generator, but nothing came on. The fuel lines had been cut. Not just worn or chewed, deliberately sliced. Someone had tampered with his emergency system on his property and done it without leaving even the courtesy of a footprint. He didn't call anyone right away. He didn't march down to the local office or throw a fit on the phone. Instead, he wrote everything down: the tag's serial number, the date, the color of the lock, the condition of the breaker box, the missing propane order, the severed fuel lines. He opened a composition notebook, the kind students use, and labeled it July Incidents. Then he took his truck into town, bought new hose lines, new fuel, and a second lock for his breaker box. He also stopped by a supply store and purchased 3 trail cameras, ones that didn't upload to the cloud, ones that stored footage locally and encrypted it. No more relying on a signal that someone else could manipulate. No more blind spots. Back on the farm, he reconnected everything himself, bypassing the tampered line. He locked the new system inside a metal box and welded the hinges shut. A temporary fix, but enough to restore power and keep the place running. When night fell, he didn't relax. He sat on the front porch with the lights dimmed low and watched the perimeter like a sentry. He wasn't expecting a truck or a crew. That wasn't their method. Whoever was behind this didn't knock or announce themselves. They crept in like smoke, quiet, pervasive, and difficult to trace. 2 days later, a small white vehicle pulled up to the edge of his private road. It didn't cross the gate. The driver remained inside for several minutes before slowly backing away. The car returned the next morning and did the same thing. On the 3rd day, it stopped again, and a young man in a pale blue shirt stepped out. He walked halfway up the path, clearly uncertain, and then paused at the "No Trespassing" sign Owen had bolted onto a wooden post. Owen stepped out before the man could get any closer. The stranger introduced himself as Micah Rowe, Community Affairs Coordinator. No official title, no badge, no card. He said he represented a non-profit partnership that had recently contracted advisory authority with the Land Use Committee, and that they were reaching out to residents in transition zones. His words were polite, fluid, full of pauses that left room for Owen to speak, only Owen didn't say anything. He just stared. Micah continued. According to their maps, Owen's barn had been listed as non-essential infrastructure. Not condemned, not removed, just non-essential. That term again. It was a phrase that hovered between meaningless and dangerous. Owen asked plainly what they wanted. Micah smiled and said they were offering support for property owners interested in integrating into the new plan. He added that some structures, barns, sheds, and non-residential units, would qualify for removal subsidies or repurposing incentives. Owen asked if there was a statute behind this. Micah deflected. Owen asked who they reported to. Micah dodged again. Finally, Owen asked what would happen if he declined. Micah's smile tightened, and he said, "I'm sure we'll find a way to work it out." The moment the car was out of sight, Owen went inside and called the county zoning office. After being transferred 3 times, he spoke to a tired-sounding clerk who took 15 minutes just to locate his parcel on their system. When she did, she confirmed that no condemnation orders had been issued, and that as far as her screen showed, his barn remained listed as a private utility structure. No changes, no flags, no red tape. Owen thanked her, hung up, and knew he was being lied to. Not by her. By whoever was operating behind the surface, whoever had the ability to print tags, cut lines, reroute services, and send unaffiliated coordinators to his gate under the guise of helpfulness. 3 days passed before the next move. It came not in the form of a person or a letter, but a vehicle. A flatbed truck, escorted by 2 compact sedans, one ahead and one behind. They drove up the private road with a confidence that suggested authorization. They didn't stop at the gate. They opened it. Someone had removed the lock. The gate swung open as if it had always belonged to them. Owen was not home at the time. He was at a nearby welding shop, picking up a custom-made iron brace for his main gate, having planned to reinforce it later that day. When he returned, he saw the vehicles from a distance, parked beside the barn, and pulled his truck to the shoulder of the dirt road. He watched for a few minutes through binoculars. The men were unloading something: metal scaffolding, tape, what looked like measurement gear, and a ground-penetrating sensor. They wore vests marked Development Review Team, a name that didn't appear on any government roster he had access to. One of them climbed onto the barn roof. Another began hammering in stakes near the foundation. Owen didn't charge in. He didn't shout. He backed away, parked around the bend, and made 2 calls. First to his attorney, second to the local sheriff's non-emergency line. He explained calmly that there were people on his property, that no prior notice had been given, and that he had reason to believe this was an unauthorized incursion under false pretenses. The dispatcher said someone would be out shortly. When Owen returned to the barn, he found the men still working, speaking to each other in clipped professional phrases. They didn't acknowledge him at first. He approached the one holding the clipboard and asked who had sent them. The man gave a name, Judy Manson, of course. He asked what documentation they had. The man hesitated, said the permit had been filed digitally, and that it was part of a routine regional reclassification scan. Owen informed him that they were on private property without legal authority and requested they leave. The man smiled thinly and said they'd be done in 20 minutes. They weren't, because 10 minutes later, Deputy Warner arrived. The deputy, a lean, straight-talking man with more years behind a badge than some of these men had been alive, took one look at the scene and immediately asked for identification and documentation. None of the crew could provide a physical copy. One tried to show something on a tablet that flickered between screens and then lost connection. Warner ordered them off the property. They protested. He didn't care. He reminded them that absence of consent and absence of warrant meant one thing: trespass. Owen didn't need to speak. He just stood beside the deputy as the team packed up, grumbling and swearing under their breath. The last man to leave muttered, "This isn't over," as he passed Owen, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't a threat. After they were gone, Warner stayed behind. He didn't say much, just advised Owen to secure his perimeter better, document everything, and call directly next time anything seemed off. Owen asked if there was anything formal they could file. Warner said not yet. Without names, documents, or damage, it would be hard to escalate. But he promised to log the incident and forward it to the county for record. As he drove off, Owen stood in the gravel, staring at the flattened grass, the stray tape blowing in the wind, the small circle of footprints near the foundation of his barn. Something bigger than zoning was moving behind the curtain. Someone wanted the land under his feet, and now they knew he wouldn't give it quietly. The next phase didn't come with the sharp drama of confrontation or the spectacle of flashing lights. It came with quiet interruptions, carefully measured interference, and a steady increase in procedural weight designed to bend a man like Owen without ever appearing to push. One morning, he opened his mailbox and found a notice from the County Sanitation Department, a formal request for a mandatory inspection of non-residential waste management facilities. The barn, listed as a mixed-use structure, had been flagged for review under a revised health and safety ordinance. The language was so convoluted, so bureaucratically dense, that Owen had to read it 3 times just to decipher the core accusation. They were implying, without saying it directly, that his property might be in violation of the code due to improper waste disposal. It was nonsense. The barn had no plumbing, no chemicals, and certainly no waste system. Still, the form instructed him to schedule an on-site inspection within 10 business days or face escalating fines. Owen didn't ignore it. He responded in writing, sent via certified mail, requesting clarification and a full citation of the statutes under which the inspection was authorized. He also sent a copy to his attorney, along with every previous notice, letter, and memo from the so-called Development Committee. The lawyer, a man named Conrad Fulton, was slow-moving and careful, the kind who didn't speak unless he had something precise to say. He called Owen 3 days later and confirmed what Owen had suspected. The sanitation department had no prior record of concern regarding his property. The inspection request was generated by external recommendation, which in bureaucratic terms meant someone had flagged him from the outside. That same week, his business insurance provider reached out to notify him of a routine policy review. According to the agent, someone had contacted them with new information, suggesting the barn had undergone significant structural modifications and might no longer qualify under its current risk category. The agent sounded apologetic, almost embarrassed, but insisted that a third-party assessor would need to visit the site. Owen asked what had triggered the review. The agent hesitated and finally admitted it was an anonymous tip submitted through the insurer's online portal. It didn't take much to piece it together. These weren't coincidences. They were coordinated. The same group that sent unauthorized crews to his land was now trying to box him in through insurance, utilities, and regulatory pressure. And they weren't coming through the front door anymore. They were seeding the ground for someone else to act, trying to set the stage for an inevitable forfeiture of control. Owen decided to act preemptively. He wasn't going to wait for them to find a technicality they could twist into leverage. He contacted a certified land surveyor, an independent contractor with no ties to the county, and had the entire property line remeasured, the boundaries flagged and confirmed with high-resolution drone mapping. He also commissioned a structural assessment of the barn itself, paying for a third-party inspection that verified the building's integrity and safety. The report was thorough, signed, and notarized. With it, he filed an official record with the county's building office, attaching both the survey and the assessment to his parcel's public documentation. The goal wasn't just defense, it was deterrence. If they tried to question the barn's legitimacy again, they'd run into a wall of legally binding paperwork. But even as Owen built that wall, the attacks kept coming. 2 weeks later, his internet service was downgraded. Not cut, not severed, just reduced. The bandwidth throttled so low that video streams wouldn't load, and uploads failed half the time. When he called the provider, they insisted he had requested a service tier change. He had not. After an hour of hold music and disconnected transfers, he was told the change had been made through the customer portal using his login credentials. The representative couldn't say from where or by whom, only that it had been authorized with the correct security information. Owen knew better than to argue with tech support. He changed every password he had, closed the customer portal entirely, and purchased a new security router with a physical toggle lock. Later that week, he received another letter, this one from a lawyer representing a private land acquisition firm called Lark and Dominion. The letter was polished, confident, and casually threatening. It referenced upcoming realignment efforts in your area and extended an offer to purchase the barn and surrounding acreage at a generous premium. The number they offered was insulting, but what stood out was the phrasing. The letter stated plainly that reallocation may proceed through non-voluntary channels, and that this offer represented an opportunity for cooperative transition rather than adversarial resolution. Owen didn't reply. He didn't need to. He already knew they were trying to soften the target before the hammer dropped. He took the letter to Conrad, who read it twice, scowled, and said simply, "They're testing the fence." It was an old ranching phrase. Before a predator attacks, it circles, watches, prods. These people weren't predators in the traditional sense. They weren't violent. They weren't dramatic. They were worse. They were patient, institutional. They didn't need to break in when they could bore through. That night, the barn door was left open. Owen had locked it. He was certain. But sometime after midnight, someone had gained entry and left the heavy wooden doors ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing damaged, No vandalism, no broken windows. But the workbench had been disturbed. Tools shifted slightly, a drawer left half open, one of the paper targets on the back wall removed from its hook and laid flat on the floor like an offering. Owen checked the trail cameras. 2 had been disabled. 1 was missing entirely. The only footage he recovered was a grainy 20-second clip from the camera mounted behind the chicken coop, showing a distant silhouette moving through the field in the dead of night. Whoever it was wore a hood and carried a tool bag. He called the sheriff's office again. Warner came personally. He filed another report, took photos, made notes. But again, without a name or plate number, there was a little he could do. "They're poking," Warner said, "trying to see what you'll do when you start feeling pressure." Owen didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply nodded, thanked the deputy, and once Warner was gone, returned to the barn. He locked it, reinforced the hinges with new steel brackets, and welded a backup bar across the inside. Then he went back to the house, took out his notebook, and made a list of everything they'd done so far. The pattern was clear. They were building a case, fabricating concern, establishing precedent, compiling incidents. They didn't want to take his barn with a bulldozer. They wanted to make him give it up voluntarily, or better yet, get caught violating some invented rule so they could revoke his rights altogether. He decided, then and there, that it wasn't enough to defend. It was time to act. Not with rage, not with violence, but with presence. He began drafting an application to certify the barn as a private instructional facility. There was precedent for it. Landowners throughout the county had converted barns, outbuildings, and sheds into everything from archery ranges to farm safety classrooms. With the right filing, the right licenses, and the right insurance, he could not only fortify his position, but force their hand. If they wanted a fight, they'd have to pick one with a registered training center, not just some stubborn farmer. And so, with calm precision, Owen Lynch started laying down the paper trail they never expected. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he had no intention of watching his land get peeled away piece by piece under the cover of legality, orchestrated by cowards who never once looked him in the eye. The application process for converting the barn into a certified instructional shooting facility wasn't fast, but it was methodical, exactly the kind of effort Owen preferred. He filed everything through a third-party compliance firm that specialized in rural property classifications, making sure every form had a legal trail and every photograph was time-stamped. He brought in a state-certified firearms instructor, a quiet man named Darius Flint who had run county-sponsored safety courses for 20 years. Together, they mapped out a usage plan for the barn. Limited hours, pre-registered guests only, strict storage protocols. The training area would be bounded by reinforced barriers and outfitted with sound-dampening insulation. Insurance coverage was expanded accordingly, and the instructor signed on as an official supervisor. By the time Owen submitted the final packet to the county, the barn had already passed 2 private safety inspections. It wasn't just a shooting space anymore. It was a facility, functional, documented, and indisputably lawful. But even as the paperwork moved through its channels, the pressure escalated. Owen started noticing unfamiliar vehicles on the road, SUVs and unmarked sedans parked just far enough from his gate to remain legal, their occupants sitting silently inside with tinted windows and idle engines. No plates were missing, but many were out of state. The same white SUV that had dropped off Judith Manson weeks ago returned twice, each time idling at the edge of his eastern field before pulling away without contact. One night, while walking the perimeter, Owen found a small drone snagged in the upper limbs of his walnut tree. Silent, disabled, but clearly active until something had gone wrong in its flight path. He took it down, removed the memory card, and stashed the components in a steel box behind the barn. The card was encrypted, and Owen didn't have the tools to decode it, but he knew someone who might. That would come later. The pivotal moment came not from one of these quiet incursions, but from a conversation that unfolded unexpectedly in town. Owen had driven in to meet with a vendor about steel delivery when he ran into Tom Edwards, a senior county planner he'd known casually for years. Tom wasn't part of the group targeting him, at least not officially, but he had access to information. They exchanged small talk at first, then Owen brought up the committee. Tom paused, hesitated, then leaned in slightly and said, "You didn't hear this from me, but there's a file. It's not public. It's under a development index, tied to a firm out of Portland. Your name's in it. Not you, exactly. Your parcel." When Owen pressed for more, Tom clammed up, said he'd already said too much, and excused himself. But it was enough. There was a back-channel plan involving his land, likely a regional expansion scheme operating under the pretext of eco-renewal or rural modernization. These firms rarely announced their moves. They bought influence quietly, secured conditional permits behind closed doors, and only when the paperwork was too thick to untangle did they go public. The committee Owen had been fighting wasn't a grassroots initiative, it was a front. And his barn, situated at a key topographical point between two major access roads, was more than an inconvenience. It was a keystone. Remove it, and the rest of the layout could be reclassified for multi-use development. Leave it standing, and the plan stalled. Realizing the scale of what he was facing didn't shake Owen. If anything, it steadied him. He'd spent enough of his life dealing with people who operated under shadows, whose confidence came not from strength, but from anonymity. He knew how to deal with that kind of threat. Make yourself visible. Be undeniable. Make it harder for them to write you off as a holdout, a relic, a bump in the road. So when the paperwork confirming the barn's instructional status came through, official seal, registration ID, the whole package, he didn't just file it. He copied it 5 times, had each notarized, and sent them to the county clerk, his lawyer, the sheriff's office, the local newspaper, and the Office of Rural Zoning Enforcement. He knew better than to expect coverage or response, but that wasn't the point. The point was record-keeping. He wasn't just Owen Lynch, the landowner, anymore. He was the registered operator of a certified training facility under state-sanctioned guidelines, with full liability coverage, registered instruction staff, and a noise abatement compliance waiver. That changed things. The week after certification, the inspections stopped. The vehicles disappeared. But the silence that replaced them didn't feel like retreat. It felt like a coiled pause. Someone was recalculating. It wasn't long before Owen got the first real sign of what that recalculation looked like. A package arrived. No return address, just a courier drop at the gate. Inside was a folded map. Not a detailed survey, but a hand-marked sketch of the valley basin, highlighting roads, lot lines, and easements. At the center, marked with a red X, was his barn. Scrawled in the bottom corner, barely legible, "No build-out until resolved." That same day, an envelope arrived in his official business P.O. box. Inside was a thin letter from a law firm representing the development group. The tone was different this time. Less forceful, more performative. It acknowledged the legitimacy of his facility, expressed appreciation for his compliance, and suggested that in light of recent tensions, they would like to offer a strategic partnership opportunity, an incentive-based program that would allow Owen to maintain property sovereignty while granting them limited infrastructural access. In exchange, they would provide ongoing maintenance support and a generous cash stipend. Owen didn't laugh. He didn't respond. He didn't even bring it up to his lawyer. He filed the letter away with the others, and then he made a second application to the State Board of Education. This one was for conditional approval to offer marksmanship and firearm safety courses for rural youth programs. It was a long shot, but it came with its own layer of legal reinforcement. If approved, his barn would become part of a statewide educational network, immune to certain forms of municipal redevelopment. That move, more than any other, changed the temperature, because a week later someone started making phone calls. Local parents received anonymous tips claiming Owen's facility was unsafe. A rumor surfaced in town that he was training people without background checks. None of it stuck. The sheriff's office had already done their walkthrough. Every document had been filed, every regulation followed. But the messaging was clear. If they couldn't win through legality, they'd try reputation. Owen expected that too, and he'd already planned for it. He didn't need to broadcast. He didn't need media coverage. What he needed was presence. So he doubled down. He hosted a free safety seminar. Just a small event, under 20 people, registered, supervised. Sheriff Warner showed up, not in uniform, just to observe. And by the time the sun set, the attendees weren't talking about rumors. They were talking about how clean the place was, how organized, how safe. Owen didn't seek their praise. He just handed out printed pamphlets on state gun laws, thanked everyone for coming, and walked back into the barn with the door open. That night, the wind came strong off the hills, stirring up dust and rattling the window panes. Owen stood by the kitchen window, watching the lights flicker on the training range, knowing that somewhere beyond the reach of those lights, someone was recalibrating again. But he wasn't worried. They were playing the long game. So was he. Under a blistering August sun that made the gravel crackle beneath his boots, Owen Lynch walked the length of his eastern boundary for the third time that morning. He wasn't surveying for crops or planning fencing adjustments or checking on his cattle. There were none of those anymore. He had sold the last of his livestock 2 years prior, after the drought made water a daily gamble and hay a luxury. But now the land wasn't the problem. People were, and he knew that the next strike wouldn't come as a notice or a courtesy visit. It would come as a trap disguised as procedure, or a provocation designed to make him the aggressor. For weeks, things had seemed to settle, on the surface. His application for integration into the state's Rural Safety Initiative had passed its preliminary review. His newly minted status as an instructional facility was on file and publicly accessible. Insurance premiums were paid ahead of schedule, the land survey filed, notarized, and duplicated across multiple county offices. Even the sheriff's office had nothing left to flag him for, and yet Owen felt it. Pressure gathering like a distant storm, one that never arrived with thunder but instead with paperwork, gray cars, and unanswered emails. The first true hit came under the guise of a county infrastructure update. Owen returned from a supply run to find his access road partially blocked by a backhoe and 3 county vehicles bearing logos he didn't recognize. The workers, 6 men in matching vests, claimed they were sent to evaluate the condition of the easement leading from the county road to his gate. It wasn't a public easement, and Owen told them so. They handed him a letter stamped with a county seal and a series of alphanumeric designations. When he read it carefully, he realized it wasn't an easement notice. It was a pre-action memo indicating that the road was being reviewed for transitional jurisdiction, meaning the county could, under select circumstances, assume control over the maintenance and access rights if the road was deemed of regional benefit. He asked them who had requested the review. No one could answer. When he called the number on the letter, it routed him to a generic voicemail box. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He took photos, logged license plates, and walked the crew off his land without incident. Then he drove straight to the county recorder's office and filed a formal landowner objection to any change in jurisdiction, attaching the original deed that established the road as a private access maintained at the owner's discretion. He had it notarized on site, certified with copies mailed to both the County Infrastructure Department and his attorney. But that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, his mailbox disappeared. Not vandalized, not smashed, gone. Post ripped from the ground, concrete base unearthed and taken. He reported it, but the Postal Service told him the removal had been authorized under new delivery logistics for reclassified routes. His address, they claimed, had been moved to a cluster box unit 2 miles down the road, right near the entrance to a new planned development project. They had no record of him declining the transition. The forms, they claimed, had been submitted on his behalf. He filed a fraud complaint. Then he bought a new box and installed it with a steel post welded directly into a concrete drum set 6 feet deep. If they wanted to take this one, they'd need excavation equipment. But the mailbox was just a signal, an indicator that the campaign had entered a new phase. They weren't just trying to classify his land. They were trying to make it unlivable, cut off the edges, starve the lines of communication, and if that didn't work, provoke him into doing something reckless, something they could leverage. The next escalation was more direct. Owen came home one evening to find 3 sheriff's cruisers at his gate. Not Deputy Warner. New faces, younger men, looking tense and cautious. They told him they were responding to a call about erratic behavior and unauthorized discharge of firearms. Owen stood there with arms folded, not moving from his porch. They asked if they could come inside to talk. He declined. They asked if anyone had been hurt. He told them there had been no discharge of any kind for days, that all activity had been logged and supervised under the instructional program. One of them asked if they could see the logs. Owen told them they'd need a warrant. They didn't have one. Eventually, after speaking to someone on the radio, they left, but not before one of them made a passing remark about community complaints and safety concerns. He filed a formal incident report the next morning, both with the sheriff's office and, through his lawyer. Conrad advised him to expect more of these. "They want you agitated," he said over the phone. "If you lash out, even verbally, they can argue that you're emotionally unfit to operate a weapons facility. Don't give them the chance." Owen took the advice seriously. He began wearing a body camera when conducting training sessions, just to maintain indisputable evidence of what happened and when. He installed more cameras around the perimeter, each with off-site backups. Everything became logged, scheduled, observed. The barn now looked less like a relic of rural heritage and more like a tactical checkpoint, secure, sober, and absolutely untouchable by ordinary means. Then came Karen. She arrived on a Sunday, unannounced, driving a spotless black crossover SUV with California plates. Her hair was pulled back tight, sunglasses perched high, and her smile came with that brittle politeness people wore like armor. She claimed to be a regional consultant for Lark and Dominion, the same acquisition firm that had mailed him earlier. Only this time there was no letter. Just her, in person, with a briefcase and a binder and a tone so faux-friendly it made Owen's teeth itch. She said she wanted to dialogue. She said there was room for a more imaginative solution. She said they respected his commitment to his land but believed he could serve the greater future of the region by becoming a stakeholder in the transition. Owen didn't invite her past the gate. She stood there for a while, trying not to lose her composure, and finally asked, "What would it take for you to reconsider?" He answered without smiling, "A different map." She didn't reply. She left behind a small folder before turning back to her vehicle. Inside were 3 glossy renderings of the proposed development plan. On each, his barn had been replaced with a community pavilion. That night, the east fence was cut. Owen found it early the next morning. One of the metal panels pulled apart, the chain severed with bolt cutters. He walked the perimeter and found boot prints in the soil, 3 sets by his count. The barn wasn't damaged, nothing inside was touched, but the message was clear. If persuasion didn't work, erosion would. They wanted to show him they could get in, that they weren't finished. He repaired the fence, reinforced it with steel rods, and added motion-triggered floodlights along the eastern tree line. Then he filed another report, submitted drone footage of the broken fence, and logged everything, down to the tread patterns on the prints. A week passed in silence. Then someone filed a formal noise complaint against his facility. The complaint was anonymous but cited excessive discharge of firearms during prohibited hours. Owen had logged every training session. None of them took place outside of approved hours. He submitted his logs, along with time-stamped video, and the complaint was dismissed. But that same day, 2 code compliance officers arrived for an unscheduled inspection, claiming they'd been alerted to potential violations. They had no warrant, and Owen turned them away. Later that night, one of his cameras caught a figure trying to access the barn door, unsuccessfully but persistent. Owen knew the playbook now. Pressure, presence, provocation. They would wear him down with volume, not velocity. But what they hadn't counted on was that Owen didn't operate like most landowners. He didn't react with panic. He didn't hire protesters or take to the internet. He fortified, documented, and pushed back within the letter of the law. And then he flipped the board. He filed a countersuit. Under a rarely used state statute, landowners operating registered educational or safety facilities could file injunctions against entities or individuals engaged in sustained harassment or interference. With enough documentation, a judge could impose legal restrictions, not just on the company, but on named employees or contractors, effectively prohibiting them from coming within a certain distance of the facility. It was a long shot, and the burden of proof was steep. But Owen had everything: names, dates, footage, logs, mail, property damage reports. His lawyer submitted a dossier over 4 inches thick, complete with sworn affidavits and 2 official statements from county officers. The suit named the development firm, Judith Manson, and Karen by full legal name. And that changed everything. Because once the court acknowledged receipt, their next move would have to be public. And that, above all, was the one thing they feared. The courthouse was small, one of those brick structures tucked between a gas station and a shuttered diner that most people passed without a second glance. But for the first time in over a decade, the hearing room was full. Not crowded, not chaotic, but full in a way that said something strange was happening. And the kind of people who usually had no business with courts or filings were suddenly sitting in rows with folded arms and skeptical expressions. Owen Lynch sat at the defense table beside his attorney, Conrad Fulton, who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days but radiated the cool, controlled confidence of a man who knew his documents were airtight. Across the aisle sat 3 representatives from Lark and Dominion. Judith Manson, hair pulled tight, jaw locked, kept tapping her pen on a legal pad. Karen, the so-called regional consultant, sat beside a younger man in a trim suit who never looked up from his tablet. None of them smiled. The presiding judge, a local appointee named Stokely, began the proceedings with a dry recitation of case numbers and procedural codes. The court was here to consider whether Owen Lynch, a registered operator of a certified firearms instructional facility, had provided sufficient evidence to support an injunction against sustained interference by Lark and Dominion Development, its named employees and affiliates. On paper, it sounded like a dry land use case. In practice, it was anything but. Owen had spent months compiling the record. What he submitted wasn't just a timeline of inconvenience. It was a comprehensive, annotated chain of harassment masked as bureaucracy. Every action had been legal in isolation: a sanitation inspection, a zoning review, a noise complaint. But when laid out together, complete with timestamps, digital correspondence, recorded conversations, and sworn statements, the pattern became irrefutable. The same individuals, the same company, acting in parallel under various titles, had repeatedly targeted his property, structure, and reputation. Conrad didn't dramatize. He didn't posture. He walked the court through the timeline like a surgeon detailing a diagnosis. First, the unsolicited survey stakes, then the power interference, the sudden mail reclassification, the unauthorized entry attempts, the drone, the noise complaints, the arrival of Karen with her false overtures of partnership. And finally, the most egregious incident, the physical trespass and tampering of the eastern fence, caught on camera and followed by the presence of unknown personnel around the barn's perimeter. He didn't call it sabotage. He called it destabilization. They couldn't take the property through eminent domain, Conrad said, so they attempted what I would describe, Your Honor, as procedural exhaustion. A deliberate, coordinated effort to disrupt, provoke, and disqualify my client from operating within his legal rights, all under the guise of compliance and community interest. The judge asked the plaintiffs to respond. Judith Manson stood, her voice cold and even. She denied the accusation of coordination. She claimed the efforts in question were coincidental, the result of overlapping jurisdictions, and in some cases third-party contractors acting independently. She admitted that, perhaps in hindsight, their approach had been overly aggressive, but denied any intent to harass. She shifted the blame to paperwork, confusion over land use classification, and even suggested that Owen's own rigidity had prevented resolution. The judge pressed her. He asked directly if she could explain the unauthorized entry attempts, the reclassification of his mailing address, or the sudden arrival of a fence-cutting crew in the middle of the night. She deflected. Her lawyer interjected. The judge allowed the objection but made a note. Conrad then presented notarized letters from neighbors, statements from Deputy Warner, and a witness list including the county planner who had tipped Owen off to the internal file tied to his parcel. The judge reviewed the map submitted by Owen, marked with the red X left anonymously in his mailbox, and asked one final question. If this man had accepted your offer, would his barn be standing today? Karen didn't answer. Judith said nothing. The silence filled the courtroom like cement. Stokely recessed the court for an hour to review the documents. When the session resumed, his decision was swift and direct. He granted the injunction. Effective immediately, Lark and Dominion and all named parties were prohibited from contacting, visiting, inspecting, or communicating with Owen Lynch or approaching within 500 feet of his barn or residence for a period of 1 year, with the possibility of renewal pending a review at that time. Any violation would be considered contempt of court, subject to fines and, if necessary, criminal charges. Additionally, the judge referred the matter to the State Land Oversight Committee for further investigation into misuse of procedural tools for private acquisition campaigns. No one cheered. No one clapped. The court clerk simply stamped the decision, and the attendees began to rise. Judith walked out without looking back. Karen didn't move for several seconds, staring at the folded rendering in her lap, the one with the community pavilion drawn neatly where Owen's barn still stood. After the hearing, Owen stepped outside into the blinding daylight, where the same sun scorched the same gravel under the same boots. But something was different now. He wasn't just a man with a barn. He was a precedent. And that meant they couldn't do it quietly anymore. They couldn't push with unseen hands. Every future move against him would be watched, filed, documented, and potentially prosecuted. Still, Owen wasn't naive. He knew that winning the court order didn't end the war. It shifted the battlefield. Back on his land, he returned to the barn and found everything as he had left it. Clean, organized, fortified. The training range was intact, the logs ready for next week's scheduled youth seminar, and the certification papers laminated and pinned to the wall beneath the framed notice of compliance. But now, beside it, he added one more document. The court's injunction, enlarged, signed, and framed. The days that followed were unusually quiet. No vehicles loitering at the edge of the property. No sudden mail disruptions or procedural requests. But Owen didn't relax. He spent that time checking his backup systems, reinforcing the camera network, updating his incident logs, and preparing for the next seasonal training cycle. He reached out to other property owners who had faced similar tactics, comparing notes, creating a network of quiet resistance. He shared his legal approach with those who asked, never volunteering it, never advertising, but making it available. A week after the hearing, a plain manila envelope arrived at his new mailbox, placed there by someone who knew not to approach the gate. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just 4 words in block type. You made us visible. Owen folded it once, placed it in the same steel box where he'd stored the drone memory card, and locked it without a word. He didn't need to show anyone. The message wasn't a threat. It was a mistake. Because visibility, to Owen Lynch, wasn't a weakness. It was armor. Autumn crept in slowly, carried on a wind that rustled the drying leaves and stirred the dust that had long since settled on the back roads leading into the valley. The fields around Owen's property began to turn brittle and golden, casting long shadows across the hills at dusk. The barn stood unchanged, solid, immovable, and now publicly documented. It had become something more than a building. It was a symbol, and symbols had a way of echoing far beyond their foundations. Word had spread, slowly at first and then with gathering momentum, about what had happened. Other landowners, some who had lived in quiet frustration for years, reached out, not to congratulate, but to understand. They wanted to know what Owen had done, how he had documented it, who he had filed with, and what it cost to take that kind of stand without being chewed up in the process. He shared only what was useful. No grand speeches, no recorded videos, just method, discipline, and precedent. With the injunction in place and the development firm silenced, for now, Owen adjusted to a new rhythm, one not without tension, but no longer dictated by constant defense. He resumed training classes, hosted monthly safety reviews, and even brought in a retired law enforcement officer to speak with the teenagers in his fall session. The barn felt alive in a new way, not just maintained, but purposed. And that purpose gave the land around it new shape, new context. It was no longer just a forgotten property in a soon-to-be suburban corridor. It was a stake in the ground, a piece of heritage made unignorable. The sheriff, Warner, dropped by once or twice, each time off the clock, each time bringing coffee and an unspoken sense of watchfulness. He never lingered long, and he never brought up the case, but his presence said more than any words could. It reminded Owen that not everyone in uniform was blind to what had been attempted, or how close it had come to being successful. Weeks passed without incident. And then, one evening, just after sundown, Owen received a letter. It didn't come through the mailbox. It was slid beneath the barn door, hand-delivered by someone quiet and familiar with the terrain. The envelope was plain, sealed not with adhesive but folded into itself like a note passed in secret. Inside was a single-page document, a scanned email dated months back, between 2 individuals whose names had been redacted. The content discussed containment protocols, and the likelihood that the barn will create sustained disruption if not reclassified through escalated channels. One line, underlined, caught his eye. If conventional pressure fails, leverage public, safety concerns. Emotional destabilization tends to shift compliance in rural resistance cases. Owen read it once, slowly, then again. He placed it in a new file, separate from the legal logs, and locked it away. He knew it wouldn't be admissible, not without verification. But it wasn't for court. It was confirmation. Proof that what he'd suspected had never been paranoia, it had been strategy. They had tried to break him not by force, but by erosion. And in failing to do so, they had not only exposed themselves, but revealed the methods that might one day be used against others. By late October, Lark and Dominion quietly withdrew their preliminary development plans for the Eastern Corridor. No announcements, no formal apologies, just a silent removal of their filings from the county's planning database. The clerk who tipped Owen off months earlier sent him a brief message. Your parcel is clean. They're gone. For now. And yet Owen knew better than to think they were truly finished. People like that didn't stop. They paused, They regrouped, they rebrand, and they wait for you to grow complacent. But Owen wasn't the same man he had been when they'd first put a stake in the ground beside his barn. He had adapted. He expanded his training program slightly, enough to qualify for additional protections under the state's Rural Development Act, effectively locking his property into a category that was near impossible to reclassify without direct legislative action. He built a secondary outbuilding, a storage facility that doubled as a meeting space, constructed entirely within zoning limits and filed under his instructional license. Everything was done above board. Every receipt, every inspection logged, notarized, and filed. His land had become a fortress not of walls, but of procedure, legal weight, bureaucratic armor. The final act came not with confrontation, but closure. One morning, Karen returned, not with a team, not with a file. Alone. She didn't approach the gate. She stood just outside the fence, arms crossed, and waited. Owen saw her from the porch. He didn't walk down. He didn't wave. He let her stand there for 3 minutes before she turned and got back into her car. As she drove away, she passed one of his new signs, freshly mounted that week. It read, "Private Facility. Registered. Observed. Protected." No drama. No